Hello, this is Mr. Smith with a daily participation, and you can go ahead and click on that and click submit or resubmit, and the text box will open up. Just type in the three most significant things for today's lesson. And today we'll be talking about poverty, one of the three major macroeconomic problems that the government tries to address. So let me just talk about poverty a little bit and what defines it. The poverty threshold is the income below which is sufficient to support a family or household. So basically below what the basic necessities are. It varies among the size of household, obviously with the fewer people, the less income that is needed. And it's done on a national average, so sometimes the numbers might not make sense in some places. For instance, for individuals in 2018, you needed $12,140 to stay above the poverty line or poverty threshold. And that would work okay in Titusville, but not necessarily in places like New York, like Manhattan, for instance, or Silicon Valley, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and California. The more children you have, then the higher the income needs to be. For a family of 6, you need $33,740. Now, the reason why that doesn't increase proportionally is because obviously you need more clothes and food and things like that, but you don't need a new house or double the amount of housing or anything like that. So you might need a slightly bigger house for a bigger family, but you don't need to double for each person that you get, for instance. So for the first person, you're going to have the same size rental unit or owned home that you are going to have for two people. Once you have a third person, you only need an extra room. It's not like you need to increase that again for each person proportionally. So the poverty rates then are the percentage of people that are below that. And there you can see the map on the screen. The states with the highest are typically in the south, and those in the north typically have lower rates. The lowest rates are in Colorado, Utah, Minnesota, New Hampshire, Maryland, Delaware, and then higher rates, the highest in the country in West Virginia, for instance, Louisiana and Mississippi. So the question is, what groups of people are more likely to be impoverished? Well, most minority groups, with the exceptions of Asian Americans, are more likely to be impoverished. Single mothers are more likely to be impoverished. Children are the age group that is most likely to be impoverished, and inner cities and isolated rural areas. Here we can see on the left-hand side of the screen, this is broken up by age group. 65 and over has been steadily falling thanks to Social Security and then Medicare in particular, where it's actually down below the poverty rate of people between the ages of 18 and 64, which is at 12.9. Then you have the blue number here, which is under 18, and you can see it's quite a bit higher, 20.7. And when you break it down even further, under 6 years of age, you can see it's even higher yet at 24.3%. So children are the most likely age group to be impoverished at this point. The percentage below the poverty line has dropped. In the 1960s, it was about 22 to 23%. And after the introduction of Great Society programs like Medicare and Medicaid, for instance, and other welfare programming, the number has fallen. By 1972 or 3, it was down to 10%. And whenever we see recessions like the early 80s, we see it bump back up to 15, and then it drops again, and then it goes back up. For instance, in the early 90s, it went back up to 15 during a recession, and then falls back down. So it generally ranges between 10 and 15%, give or take a few percentage points. So the question is, how do we get it to go lower? Obviously, one of the reasons why it is higher is because children are included, and they end up causing the overall poverty rate to be higher than what we thought before. So the question is, what do we do about that? How do we solve that problem? Now, there are causes of poverty. One of them would be lack of education. So as you increase a person's education level, of course, the average level of income also increases typically. That isn't necessarily always true, but that's the way the average goes. Location has a lot to do with it. Inner city residents are less likely to own automobiles, be able to get back and forth, even though cities might seem like, oh, can't they just go wherever? That isn't necessarily true, because cities can be quite large, and it can take a long time to get through traffic. There are different sections of cities, often with higher incomes and more job opportunities, and sections of the city with the opposite of that. And so the problem is how do you end up being able to have good transportation to get back and forth within that community, and Some people would say, well, why don't you just move to the places where there are more jobs? But typically they have higher rents, mortgages, and property taxes. Rural areas, of course, it's because they're distant from everything. Isolated rural areas are defined by the definition that they have more than 30 minutes travel time to the nearest interstate. And because of that, businesses are less likely to want to be located there because they have to ship things further. And so there's less job opportunities. Discrimination is also another cause. Obviously, people of European descent have benefited from laws that treated them better than other groups of people. That type of discrimination, known as de jure discrimination, DE space JURE, that is legal discrimination, and it is now unconstitutional in the United States. But obviously, it has lingering effects. For instance, there are people in their 60s or 70s that were still younger when discrimination was allowed. And there is still de facto discrimination that just happens, a matter of fact. It's random, it's sporadic, and there's a limited number of people that participate in it, but obviously it still has an impact on individuals. Men do earn more than women, and there's some reasons to explain that. One of them being that women are more likely to take time off for childbearing and raising children, and that brings down their lifetime averages, which then transfers over to a decrease in the average that they earn per hour. That can be fixed with paid parental leave for both genders, but of course, even then, statistically speaking, it's less likely that men will take advantage of that. But that would help probably to change that number. Discrimination is diminishing in our other programs, scholarships, affirmative action, which gives extra points to people from a background where they may have been discriminated against and had to work harder to get to a position. So all these types of programmings can help alleviate past discrimination. Economic shifts are bad times that hurt the poor worse. And so this is another cause of poverty. Whenever a contraction happens or the economic slowdown during the COVID pandemic, for instance, poor people typically are the first ones to lose their jobs. And then family structure. Two incomes is always better than one. It's just mathematically speaking and statistically speaking that we see a two-person head of household typically is less likely to be impoverished. That doesn't mean, of course, people should stay together if they don't like each other, but at the same time, mathematically speaking, it just means a less likelihood of being in poverty. And then what can we do about all these things? Well, that depends. Some people think poverty is just that. It's those below the threshold. Others think it's because wealthier people are making too much money. And certainly there is income inequality in the United States. If you break the country apart into 5 income groups, the bottom 20% would be the lowest earners, the top 20% being the highest earners. You can see that the top earners of 20% earn an enormous amount of the national income, whereas people in the bottom 20% earn less than 5% of the total income or wealth of the country. It depends on which one you're looking at. There's income inequality and there's wealth inequality. Income is how much you're earning, wealth is how much you have. But in both those circumstances, people in the bottom 20% have a very small percentage in the single digits. Some people say that should be alleviated by providing better education, training programs, and skills for job entrance. And of course, one of the reasons why this happens is because obviously the lower income you are, the less you have to pass on through means of inheritance. And then there are the actual anti-poverty programs that already exist. Enterprise zones are areas of underdevelopment that businesses are lured to by tax breaks. So you get rid of the taxes, businesses come into that community, hire people. The problem is who's paying for the roads and bridges and the police and everything like that if these businesses are not paying taxes. So that can be controversial sometimes. Government employment assistance, such as training and unemployment insurance and the minimum wage, help keep people above poverty, but obviously that doesn't help if the minimum wage stays in place for a long time because inflation eventually erodes it. And unemployment insurance is controversial because the question is, how long do you let people stay on there after they've gotten laid off? And then there's what we generally think of as welfare. Food stamps, which in itself helps pay obviously directly for food, but then the question is, how healthy should that food be? What kind of food should they be allowed to buy? The more restrictions and the more requirements you put on it, the more paperwork is needed. And the more paperwork you have, the more bureaucrats or government workers, civil servants are needed. And the more office buildings of government workers are needed. No more payroll for government workers is needed. So the more requirements you put on things like food stamps, actually the more expensive and complex it becomes. Then you have women, infant, and children, or WIC, and that's a good example. People who say food stamps should be more Healthy, for instance, probably want it to be more like WIC, where they have to go in, they are only allowed to buy certain foods, they have to pull out a slip of paper and get that checked off, the cashier has to sign off on it, that has to get sent into the government to make sure that it's audited and checked to make sure that no one was buying things they shouldn't. And of course, they can't let the grocery store do that, just in case the grocery store might be in on it too, if they are involved in some kind of scam. And so this involves bureaucracy and paperwork. And so WIC is an example of what food stamps might look like if people wanted those requirements to be put into place. Plus, there's also help with heating and electric and other types of utilities for the poor, often offered through private companies. And then there's public housing, which can either be apartment buildings or houses owned by the government, rented out to people that are impoverished, or people can receive a voucher, a statement saying that they will get a certain amount of money for rent, and they can go to a private landlord if they accept it in order to pay to live there. And then there's welfare to work. This is a phrase that's been used since the 90s, and it changed the old welfare cash system to the new one, which is known as TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. And what this welfare to work and TANF did is it gives the money to the states instead of the federal government running this program. And the states get a block grant of money, and they're allowed to use it to implement cash payments for people of low income, but they have to meet the following requirements. People are only allowed to stay on it for 2 consecutive years for a total of 5 years in their lifetime. So they're on it for 2 years, they get off, another year or two passes by, they get back on it again, they're on it for another 2 years, then another couple years goes by, then they're on it for a 5th year. That's the maximum they're allowed to have. So 2 consecutive years and 5 years in a lifetime. All recipients that are adults and able-bodied must find work in 2 years. Single parents must work at least 30 hours per week, and if there's 2 parents in a household, they must work at least 35 to 55 hours per week. So some of the stereotypes that we think of when it comes to welfare, oh, they don't work, or oh, they're using drugs, or oh, they have too many children, just about all these are untrue. When states have tried drug testing programs, they have found extremely few people that have been using drugs. And so actually the cost of running the program is much greater than the amount they save from kicking a small number of people off. And so this is another example. When you put a requirement on a program, it actually becomes more expensive. And then you have to have government employees that are hired just to run that program. And so you end up having more government employees, more bureaucrats. Another stereotype, they have more children. That's actually not true. They actually have less children than on average. Another one is that they don't work. Well, obviously, in this program indicates that they do have to have jobs. In fact, most people on welfare do have some type of employment at any given time. And a lot of people say that the welfare system gives them lots of cash so they can buy nicer things. And there is some truth to that, but that's because of one of the restrictions placed on welfare. If you end up saving too much money, then you end up penalized, and then your cash payments are cut back on. Or, for instance, if you're getting a voucher for housing, that is lowered, and you have to pay more yourself for the rent. And so that eats away at your savings, and you end up having less money than you would have if you hadn't saved all that money to begin with. And so you don't have enough to get by to pay your bills. And so really, I mean, people say, oh, if you're poor and you're accepting welfare, you shouldn't be saving all kinds of money. That's not right, that you're able to save money, and I'm a taxpayer and I can't save that money. So people complain about it. So the government puts restrictions, basically saying that they can only have so much cash on hand. So then what do people do? They go out and spend it. And so that's another one of the counteractions. Whenever you have some type of restriction put on because people want their tax dollars protected, there are going to be undue circumstances that happen. And it's going to cause an effect that people really weren't counting on in the first place. Another method that was floated by a conservative economist by the name of Milton Friedman is a negative income tax. And he basically said that wealthy households would have money transferred to the poor. The rich would pay a tax based on earning. The poor would receive assistance, or a negative tax. And so poor families would receive no aid. However, he indicated that would be it. All that they would have to do is report their income, and that's it. There'd be no other requirements. He didn't believe, we should check to see if they're buying the right things, or if they're having healthy foods, or what are they doing with this money, because he demonstrated that created more expensive programs. So the least expensive and simplest method to helping the poor would just be to give them straight cash, and that would be it. So those are some of the things, obviously, that are controversial, that exist, and debatable in order to confront poverty.